Hey, welcome to the episode 24 of Take It EV 24, this time available as a motion picture. Today we are talking about batteries. How do they work? The pack voltage. Will we ever see them charging in minutes? All that good stuff. So sit back and relax and watch the episode, listen to the interview. We've got an interview with Euan McTurk. He's been requested by so many people. We finally found the time to sit down and talk about it. Sadly not in person, but hopefully this is going to be enjoyable. And it's going to be available on YouTube as well, if you're listening to this as an audio. Apologies in advance for the quality of the recording. It was a Skype conversation, and I couldn't use this setup to record it, sadly. But nonetheless, the format and the questions, it's all worth it. So.
So, thanks for having us on. I'm Dr. Euan McTurk, and I'm a consultant battery electrochemist who's been working with and driving electric vehicles for just over a decade now. I'm also the creator of the YouTube series Pluglife Television, which explains complex battery electrochemistry in a way that anyone can understand, and also demonstrates how the entire nations can decarbonise their transport, not just cars, but looking at other forms of transport too, and also busts many myths around battery tech along the way.
Cool. So should I refer to you as Dr. Euan, or just is Euan?
I'll just go with Euan.
Okay. I know it takes a very long time to actually get the doctor in front of your name. So some people prefer others. But let's go with casual then. So I've got loads of smart listeners. I don't want to take away from them, but obviously it would be nice to just have like a basic understanding of what is a battery and why do we need them and what's so great about them.
Yeah, so a battery is an electrochemical means of storing energy, of storing electricity. It's a very efficient way of storing energy as well. If you look at the likes of a round trip efficiency of a lithium-ion battery in terms of energy in versus energy out, it's typically about 85% efficient, if not more. So you compare that to other technologies. You compare that to the low tens of percent efficiency of an internal combustion engine, or sort of 50 to 60% efficiency of a fuel cell. It's certainly a very efficient way of storing energy. Admittedly, in terms of the capacity that can be stored per kilogram, gravimetric energy density, or per litre volumetric energy density, that's where batteries have generally fallen down over the years. But we're now seeing with the last sort of decade or so of developments, in particular with electric vehicle batteries with lithium-ion, that's genuinely not becoming an issue anymore. You've got sort of budget-esque vehicles like the Renault Zoe, like the MG5 that can do close on 200, if not more, 200 miles per charge. And their costs are broadly comparable with an equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. Given that most people need to stop before 200 miles of continuous driving, otherwise they can't feel their legs, that's easily enough range. So batteries are definitely at a stage now where we're seeing a mass takeoff on electric vehicle uptake, because we've kind of reached that sweet spot. But lithium-ion batteries are nowhere near done yet, and there's all sorts of exciting chemistries we'll get onto later on as well, no doubt, in this chat. So batteries they've finally caught up with road transport and other transport means as well, having been a fantastic starting point for horseless carriages, at the end of the Victorian era. But that was when roads were particularly rubbish and top speeds were very low. Actually, lead-acid batteries back then could give you about 100 miles per charge, because Indeed. You didn't need much power, because the top speed was only going to be about 5 or 6 miles, or 5 or 6 miles per hour. Yeah. Of course, when roads improved and top speeds improved, the power required to sustain those top speeds got higher, and that's when lead-acid just couldn't cope with it. But lithium-ion, we're now at that stage where we can actually provide that amount of energy and that amount of power that's required to sustain a modern vehicle to the standards that we would expect.
Okay. And obviously, like just in terms of the battery, like the basics, it literally just stores electrons, right? That's like the very low level.
Yeah,
way
so I
to
mean,
understand.
it stores it in means of a chemical reaction, and depending on the chemistry, there are so many different chemistries out there. A
Okay.
lead acid battery is a completely different beast to a lithium ion battery, for example. And if anything, lithium ion batteries are probably one of the most different chemistries to any of the kind of predecessors within the automotive world. If you look at lead acid, if you look at nickel cadmium, nickel metal hydride, lithium ion is very different because the only thing that takes part in the reaction really is lithium atoms, which when the battery is fully charged, all the lithium atoms are intercalated or pigeonholed into sheets of graphene that make up the graphite within the negative electrode. So they fit in between those layers of graphene in little pigeonholes.
Okay.
And they're all there. When it comes to discharging the battery, what happens is that the lithium atoms each lose an electron and become a positively charged lithium ion. That is able to travel through the cell, through the separator, and the electrolyte, the ionically conductive liquid that has a lithium-based salt in it that allows lithium ions to travel between the two electrodes. And that then pigeonholes into a lithium metal oxide structure in the positive electrode. But the electron can't go through the cell, through the inside of the cell. It needs to find another way to go and recombine with that lithium ion. So it has to take the external circuit, which is whatever you've plugged that battery into, in this case, an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
And
Well,
powers
that makes it power to whatever you plugged into it. Yeah, that's a much better explanation that you could come up with. But then that's why you're the expert. So far in sort of electric cars, that we see on the market today, and for the past, I don't know, about 10 years, the battery packs have been 400 volt based. But we've seen recently an increase, or some OEMs started testing 800 volt, and Porsche Taycan is already 800 volt based system. I think one of the Audis is as well, if I'm not mistaken. e-tron, is it?
I think the e-tron might actually be limited to 400.
Is it? Okay.
But I could be wrong. But I'm sure that they'll have an 800 volt, considerably more impressive system on the way. Yeah.
Do you think that never mind the battery chemistry, but from your perspective, do you think that that's going to go further? So are we going to see 1200 volt, 3000 volt batteries packs in the future?
I think that 800 volts is a pretty good trade-off because it's already something you do not want to drop a spanner across the top of. It's not something you accidentally want to touch both of those terminals. Realistically, if you're going above, now this depends on which engineer you talk to, but sort of 48 volts to 72 volts, you go above that and you want to really start wearing big, thick rubber gloves, the proper, the PPE, the personal protective equipment that's rated for high voltage. Because whereas AC electricity will blow you away from it, so you touch it and it blows you clear of it, DC, which is what you get in a battery, will stick you to it. So, the only way that you're getting off of that is if someone pulls you off of it with a hook, an insulating hook, or once the battery is depleted. So, you definitely want to avoid going anywhere near high voltage systems if you can avoid it. Obviously, within an electric car, you're never going to come into contact with that. And there's so much safety mechanisms built into an EV that even when it comes to dropping out that battery pack, they've got like midpoint isolators which will section the battery pack into lower voltage sections. Lower voltage, not necessarily down to module level, but certainly make it a much more bite-sized kind of voltage for a mechanic to handle or an engineer to handle.
Yeah.
800 volts is particularly good because that means that you can use less current to achieve a higher power. Power is current times voltage. We're already seeing the limitations of 400 volt packs with today's high power charging infrastructure, because you look at quite a lot of rapid or high power chargers that are out there at the moment. The likes of the Instavolt systems and some of the ones that Osprey are starting to use, Motor Fuel Group as well, that are kind of 125 to 150 kilowatts. And those are, that's very much an up to figure. It's not necessarily it will definitely charge your car at that. Obviously, if you have like an older Nissan Leaf that tops out at 50 kilowatts, you're not going to get higher than that. But if you have something like, I think the Audi e-tron says that it will do 150, 155 kilowatts. If you were to plug into one of these rapid chargers, high power chargers that says it will do up to 125, up to 150 kilowatts, then power is limited to the maximum current that the cable on that rapid charger or high power charger can provide, and the voltage of the battery pack. Now, bearing in mind that it's a 400 volt battery, and bearing in mind that the vast majority of these high power chargers top out at 250 amps on CCS, that means you're limited to 400 times 250, which is 100 kilowatts.
Mm-hmm.
So, your e-tron driver is going to be like, this isn't charging my car as fast as it could. Actually, yeah, it's just the limits of it. That's the absolute maximum. Then, you unplug and a Porsche Taycan comes along that has an 800 volt battery pack. It will draw that full 125, 150 kilowatts, no bother.
Yeah.
So that's part of the appeal. That's why we've got the Hyundai Ioniq 5 has an 800 volt pack architecture. It seems to be the way to go because it means you can get away with using thinner, lighter cables that need less cooling as well because there's less current going through them. Because, if you have a 400 volt system that will do greater than 150 kilowatts, you're really starting to look into cooling these big, heavy cables. And, it starts to get to the realms of needing reasonable upper body strength. And plus, there's the issue of what happens if the cooling system kind of corrodes through to the electrical system and all of this. I believe there have been some teething problems with some of those charger types. 800 volt basically resolves that issue. To go any higher than that would, to 1200 volt to 3000 volt, as you suggested. To be honest, for road-based applications, I doubt that we would need to go to that because, if you look at the CCS standard, it can do up to 350 kilowatts. The Porsche Taycan can recharge itself in almost no time at 270 kilowatts. But do we really need cars to charge faster than this? Because the Taycan and the Tesla Model 3 and various modern EVs can rapid charge within the average dwell time at a UK motorway service station. They are adding hundreds of miles in under 25 minutes. And in fact, when the latest version, the V3 supercharger, 250 kilowatts, was unveiled in the US, now bearing in mind that the US is where people are used to doing stupidly high mileage, like mega road trips. In Europe, we're a bit more limited in what we would consider an acceptable mileage.
Indeed.
Tesla Model 3 drivers actually complained in a good way about the V3 superchargers because their car was fully charged before they'd had a whiz and a sandwich. So, genuinely, the convenience of an EV, part of the convenience is that rapid charging, it doesn't need to be 5 minutes because a petrol car, you have to go out of your way to the petrol station, and that includes at the motorway service station. You've stopped, you've gone for a whiz and a sandwich, you now need to join the queue for that petrol station, fill up with the petrol, go into the shop and pay by card, blah, blah, blah. But with a Tesla or an Ioniq 5 or a Taycan or, to be honest, most modern EVs, you sit on you plug it into the Ionity charger, you plug it into the Tesla supercharger, you go into the service station, have a whiz and a sandwich and come back to a car that's pretty much fully charged. So you've spent literally seconds of your time recharging it. Although it's physically taken longer to refill than the petrol car did, in terms of your own time, you've only spent seconds, not the best part of 10 minutes. So I don't think there's any point in a higher voltage. I think we've probably reached peak pack architecture. Could go higher, who knows? But I think 800 volts is pretty reasonable for real world use.
In terms of like the pure engineering, how do you think they achieving that? Because obviously there is, we already know that there's a certain limit in terms of the storage per cubic feet or meter. Apologies, I've just unplugged myself. The storage space. So obviously you're limited that way, and obviously each cell has certain voltage. How do you make sure? How do you then come from 400 volt pack in the same area storage space to 800 volts? What do you do? Can you actually engineer or design each individual cell to have double the voltage?
Oh God, no.
No? Okay.
If you were to do that with a lithium-ion cell, you would fry it. So a typical lithium-ion cell that has a cobalt-based chemistry, that said, there's an increasingly small amount of cobalt in lithium-ion cells. But if you're looking at the likes of NMC, nickel manganese cobalt oxide, that's the most commonly found in electric vehicles, or NCA, nickel cobalt aluminium oxide, used by a lot of Teslas. Then typically the minimum cell voltage, according to the manufacturer's spec sheet, will be between 2.5 and 3 volts. The car will probably be reluctant to take it below 3 volts, regardless of what the spec sheet says. And the maximum voltage is going to be 4.2 volts. The car will likely be reluctant to take it much above 4.15. Incidentally, the same type of cell, theoretically, in a smartphone or a laptop, the manufacturers would push those limits all for the sake of a few minutes extra runtime. There's really not that much extra energy to be gained, but you lose a lot of lifespan. So EVs have those kind of buffers, those state of charge or voltage buffers that just help to protect the lifespan by reducing degradation that happens at very high or very low voltage. So if you go above 4.2 volts in a conventional lithium-ion cell, then you start to degrade the electrolyte against the positive electrode, the cathode. That can lead to not only reduced performance and reduced capacity, etc., but you can end up with flammable gases being created within the cell. It becomes very volatile, and that's when you can end up with gassing of, very, very hot gases. You can end up with fire as well. So you don't want to be going anywhere above 4.2 volts with a lithium-ion cell, realistically.
I see.
And as long as you keep them within their safe limits, they're great. You have to do something really, really stupid to blow up a lithium-ion cell. Trust me, I worked in the abuse chambers at WMG, University of Warwick. It's damn hard to blow these things up on purpose. You have to be properly maniacal about how you treat them. Anyway, so what you'd be doing at a pack level to achieve 800 volts is you would not be building, charging each cell to double the voltage. Absolutely not. What you'd be doing is the pack has an SP configuration, a series parallel configuration. So cells in series are connected positive to negative to positive to negative and so on. And that creates the series step kind of staircase to get to the right system voltage that you're after. But that staircase might not be wide enough to get enough electrons up and down it, because you're limited to the maximum current of an individual cell in series, because that current has to go through that one cell per step, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you are basically trying to funnel, I'm trying to think like Oxford Circus tube traffic up a typical household staircase, that's not going to happen. You need it to be a wider staircase. You need to connect them in parallel.
You need multiple escalators or staircases, basically. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
So in parallel, you've got positive to positive, negative to negative. You've increased the capacity of the battery pack. So the overall energy that you can store within the battery pack is equal to the voltage multiplied by the capacity in ampere hours. So what you would do to switch from a 400 volt architecture to an 800 volt architecture in the same space is you would half the number of cells in parallel and double the number of cells in series. So that is the exact same number of cells, you're just connecting the bus bars differently. Yeah. So say, for the sake of argument, that it was an 8S 4P pack. That's going to be nowhere near 400 volt architecture. 400 volt, I should know this. I'll get my calculator. Let's do this properly, shall we? That's going to annoy me now. So it'd be 192, is it? God's sake. 192. I was going mad there. I was thinking, is that the maximum voltage or the nominal voltage, which is like half charged? Have I got it the right way around? Yes, I do. So 96S 4P would become 192S 2P. And that means you've got your 800 volts. You've ultimately got the same capacity, but it means you could charge the car, in theory, faster on a high power charger that says it's up to whatever many kilowatts, but is limited to X number of amps.
I do wonder if because obviously you can still rock up to a charger that's 50 kilowatts, say, and it's only going to allow you to charge up to, say, 500 volts. So you have to be backwards compatible. And I do wonder if they have any ability to change the number of SNPs, around so that it's 400, 800 volts, depending on what's required.
Now, I have heard of who was it I was reading about the other day. There's definitely some manufacturers, or at least one manufacturer, that is looking into the switching of the architecture so it can derate to 400 volts for those kind of situations, I suppose. And it just makes it that bit easier to work with as well from an engineering perspective. So that is something that has been toyed with. Whether the Porsche already does that or not is a different matter, or whether it's some sort of step-down voltage converter that it has within the car. Yeah. But the fact is that it's able to take a full 800 volts, whereas a 400 volt EV could not, and would be limited to, obviously to charging at whatever the maximum current in that cable would facilitate.
Okay. So I always thought that so how is it possible to increase the voltage of a cell, or is it obviously the area of the cathode and anode that gives you the amperage, right? What changes the voltage of the cell?
So the capacity of the cell, as you say, is determined by the total surface area of active material, the cathode and the anode together. And so in a cylindrical cell, you've got two long continuous strips, one of anode and one of cathode, and they're all wound up in what's called a jelly roll. The other way of doing it is you get lots of stacks of your anode and cathode, anode and cathode, anode and cathode. You connect them all in parallel inside the cell, and that gives you an increased capacity of cell. The way that you would increase the voltage of the cell, to be honest, with conventional lithium-ion chemistry, we're not really going to be increasing the voltage that much, because you need to start looking into redox mediators and sort of basically sort of dopants, if you wish, within the electrolyte, which help to reduce these degradation mechanisms that happen at high voltage, because electrolytes at the moment are not very stable at the high voltage in lithium-ion cells, the electrolytes that we use today. There are attempts to try and stuff the voltage up towards 5 volts just to get a bit more capacity out of it, but that does require a very sturdy electrolyte that's not going to degrade. So what happens actually with your with this electrolyte degradation is that the potential difference of the cell, or the voltage of the cell, is the potential difference between the anode and the cathode. So each of these electrodes has a so-called standard potential, or has a potential, I should say, which you cannot measure in isolation. You need to measure it against something else. So that's why voltage is the potential difference. It's cathode minus anode. So what we do within the world of battery electrochemistry is we know the potential of the anode and the potential of the cathode versus lithium. We can't measure that in an actual cell. You need to put in what's called a reference electrode, a lithium reference electrode, a third electrode, which would allow you to accurately measure it. But we have a rough idea of what those potentials are from the lab. And the high potential of the cathode when the cell is fully charged, because when the cell is charging, the cathode, the positive electrode, gets more positive, gets a higher potential. The negative electrode gets a more negative potential, going down towards 0 volts versus lithium. And at a certain threshold, just above 4 volts, really, your cathode potential gets to the point where this electrolyte starts to degrade. So that's what's causing the issue. That's where the instability comes from. The electrolyte cannot cope with that potential. So it's not technically the voltage that's the issue, it's the potential of the cathode that's the problem.
Okay, so we're testing the limits, and then we're kind of finding, in reality, we need to use it within these two parameters to actually end up with something that's usable for, certain amount of cycles and all that. Okay. It's an interesting subject to me, because obviously when you think about the pack that's 800 volts now versus 400 volts, one of the ways you would think, okay, each cell has increased voltage, but like you said, that's not the way this works. And I was wondering, and I needed somebody to actually explain this to me. So thank you.
No worries.
So the question that I get asked all the time, and we've already touched on that, but will we ever see a battery that recharges in a couple of minutes, or will it always be the way it is when you have the curve, and you kind of you have to kind of throw the electrons at the right speed into the battery to be safe?
So in the lab, yes, we'll likely see an increasing number of batteries that can recharge in a very short period of time. Exactly what capacity they will have, exactly what energy density they will have is a different matter. There are some academic developments that have managed to get recharging times down to 10 minutes or less. For example, this has been achieved by heating the cells up to about 60 degrees C during rapid charging. And lithium-ion cells do not really like to go above 30 degrees C, to be honest. That's when degradation starts to increase, particularly above 40 degrees C, to be fair. 30 is okay, but the cooling system will try and keep the battery down towards about 25 if it can. Above 40, you're really going to, for a prolonged exposure, going to be degrading the cell. So 60, like, why are we doing this? Why is that? Surely that'll damage it. Turns out during rapid charging that the trade-off of the amount of degradation that takes place within a few minutes of super fast rapid charging versus the lower internal resistance that comes from lowering the heat means that you can stuff in more energy in a quicker period of time as long as you immediately cool the battery afterwards. And actually Tesla does something similar to this with the superchargers, because if you put in on a Tesla on the sat-nav that you're going to a supercharger, it preheats the battery to about 50 degrees C in anticipation. So it's warmed up in time for arrival, and then as soon as it's finished charging, it immediately chucks on the cooling system to extract that heat again as quickly as possible. So that's something that's already being done today. But then you've got the likes of the company StoreDot, which has created a lithium-ion battery which can recharge in about 5 minutes. However, there's the engineering implications of that, because that means you're dumping a lot of power for a long-range EV, or a lot of energy as well as a lot of instantaneous power in a very short period of time. And that entails a pretty sizable grid connection and a pretty sizable piece of charging infrastructure in order to do that. And that adds expense, and that's going to be passed on to the end user. So realistically, there will be some applications where that will be useful, but the additional cost of doing that is arguably not really justified in the real world, as I mentioned previously. For the vast majority of people, that kind of 20-ish minute, maybe slightly longer refueling time or recharging time is actually perfect, because that's enough time for you to stretch your legs, have a quick bite to eat, and that's what you were going to do anyway after X hundred number of miles, and you're back on the road again. So do we really need them to charge that fast? I would say no. And of course, the vast majority of charging, now I'm not denying for a second that high power charging is essential, because it's needed for when you're out and about, when you're undertaking these long journeys. But the vast majority of EV drivers are going to slow charge overnight, on street, in a charging hub, at home, at fleets in a depot. That's going to be utilising excess renewable electricity overnight when nothing else is using electricity because everyone's asleep. So actually that helps to balance the grid, and it's cheaper, and you wake up to a full battery in the morning. So you've literally spent seconds of time doing hours of charging. And in some cases, actually, if you're on dynamic electricity tariffs that track the wholesale price of electricity, if it's a particularly windy night, you could get paid to charge your car. So yeah, I do have reservations about stupidly fast, like let's try and replicate petrol refilling time sort of things, because do we really need to do that? The infrastructure is going to be mightily expensive. High power charging, 100, 150, 350 kilowatt, absolutely. But much beyond that for a typical passenger car or van, probably not going to be that much of a biggie, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's something that I hear from people who never driven an EV. Never mind, they're just trying to think about which is a fair enough, like thinking scenario. Like you think, I have this car, I'm gonna have to drive an EV in the future. How will this compare? But I always tell people it's like thinking, okay, well, I used to have holes in a buggy, and now I'm thinking about a car, and trying to do like for like. It's never that way. I was just wondering, the question was just purely from engineering perspective, like do you or scientific perspective, I suppose. Like you said, the sheer size of the connector would be, and the cable would be just enormous, and obviously the cost of that. Never mind, it wouldn't be bendable. Like there's just so many things that people don't think about in terms of physics. But yeah, there are already batteries in buses and lorries and all sorts of things that have a massive pantograph that just drops on top of the bus and recharges within minutes. ABB makes them. Well, I've been to Krakow in Poland in August, and just outside of the railway station there, they've got one of those chargers. The bus comes along, drops in, and it's done. But nobody wants that for a little electric car, a family car, to something to drop on top of it, just to recharge.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's very much horses for courses.
Okay.
And, the bus idea is a really good one. I believe they may be using supercapacitors, at least in conjunction with batteries, if not exclusively supercapacitors, which do have crazy high power density. They're completely solid state, so there's no ions moving in the structure. It's all to do with charge particles, sort of things, and that means that you've got an incredibly long cycle life as well. They can do like 1 million plus cycles without any issues. But the energy density is comparatively very low. It's about 1/10 of that of lithium ion. So I'm aware of some buses that have supercapacitors that do short hops between stops, will use the pantograph system to recharge enough to get to the next bus stop and then charge there again and again and again and again. Whereas you've got the likes of a company up in Dundee called Ember, which is running intercity electric coaches from Dundee to Edinburgh and back again on comfortably less than one charge. That's fully battery-powered electric buses. And then they're using a 150 kilowatt charger to recharge at the Dundee terminus. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, batteries are more than capable of doing the distance. But, for the short hop idea with the pantographs, that is something else that's being done in some cities, and it seems to work quite well.
I think they've got lithium ion batteries that are just configured to charge at stupendously high speed, but don't quote me on that. Because the bus driver that I was trying to engage with and talk to him about it, he had no idea. So
fair enough. Yeah.
Like if we're gonna have time, I would like to actually go back to solid state batteries, because that's another question and that's another thing that actually comes back every so often. But I wanted to ask you first about, because this is we've touched on that again. Why do this is the question that I get all the time, and everyone gets that. It's it always says this battery pack will charge up to 150 kilowatts. 70, whatever. And people are always interested, like, well, I've plugged it in and it's only charging at 20 kilowatts, and then it jumps up to 70 for a couple of minutes and then drops off. Like, why is there a charging curve? Like, why can't we have the battery that just, because when you're filling a bucket of water, say, you're dumping it mostly, at the highest speed you can, and then you kind of just measure it towards the end. Why can't we do the same thing with the battery?
So, with the initial kind of slower charging speed that you mentioned before it starts ramping up, that's probably because the battery or the charger is cold. And it's only once they've kind of warmed up that the internal resistance decreases enough for the car and the charger to say, yep, okay, gie l'aldi, and just stuff in as much power as we can deal with. However, in a battery you have something called overpotential, and that is the voltage jump in comparison to when the battery was resting, when the individual cells were resting with no current applied or being stuffed into it, and then what happens when you charge it. And that means that voltage does jump up a bit, and that is related to the internal resistance of the cell. So as you are charging the battery, as you start to approach a higher state of charge, the individual cell voltages reach their maximum voltage, and they cannot exceed that, or you end up with the electrolyte degradation that I mentioned previously. So the charger has no option but to throttle back the charging power that's being delivered to the vehicle to prevent the cells from exceeding their maximum voltage. So they've gone from constant current, CC, to constant voltage, CV. So CC-CV charging is a typical pattern for charging a battery. Or the individual cells within a battery. So that's why for a lot of electric vehicles, the time taken to go from 0 to 80% state of charge on a rapid charger is about the same as going from 80 to 100%. Now, with that does vary depending on your EV. Some of them will taper off in a bit more of a sort of conservative linear manner. I believe Teslas are quite bad for that, actually. Whereas some of them will go full power and then just suddenly drop off a cliff. And then there's some that kind of do a stepped reduction. And that's all down to the discretion of the algorithm that has been employed by the battery management system for that particular car. Okay. So some of them definitely go conservative to just try and eke out that bit more lifespan by not putting too much stress on the cell, or cells, I should say. But for a typical car, around about 80% is when you start to see some significant charging power tapering off. To be honest, you are quicker on a cross-country trek, discharging down to about 20% state of charge, then pulling into a rapid charging hub and charging up to 80% and then getting on your way again, than you are waiting for the car to get to 100% and then moving on. So you're doing two things. One, you're saving your own time, and two, you're saving everyone else's time, because you're freeing up that rapid charger for someone else who needs to use it to rapid charge. Because bear in mind, going from 80 to 100% on a rapid charger, you might as well be using an adjacent Type 2 destination charge point. Indeed. Because you are wasting everyone's time. Yeah. That is a key lesson in EV ownership, and it's something that annoyingly on free rapid chargers in particular, there's a lot of EV newbies, including some taxi drivers, who don't do this, and it's particularly annoying because especially in an area that has limited charging infrastructure, it's important to utilize it as efficiently as possible, and you're genuinely more efficient charging to 80-ish%. And for the vast majority of EVs, as I said, that 80 that I mentioned, that will vary depending on your car, but the vast majority of them are going to be nearer to 80 or 90 than they will be to 100%, that kind of taper off point. There's no point in just trying to eke that last drop, that last electron out of a rapid charger. If you really need the range, jump onto a Type 2 post next to it if you can, free it up for the person behind you.
Yeah. So does that mean that if someone designed a battery pack that stays within 2080 range and keeps it warm or at the optimal temperature for either discharge or charge, that it would have more flattened charging curve then?
Absolutely, and we've seen this already because the Audi e-tron has a reasonably big state of charge buffer at the top, so it will rapid charge quite close to full power, almost all the way up to 100% from what I've been told. Similarly, Tesla for a long time sold Model S's with, I think it was the 75 kilowatt hour battery pack, but you had the option to buy that with only 60 kilowatt hours usable. And then you had to pay Tesla to unlock the rest of the capacity. And that meant that when you were supercharging, because that extra 15 kilowatt hours had been blocked out, what was 100% on the dash was nowhere near 100% in reality, which meant that the cell voltages weren't reaching 100%. And that car would supercharge pretty much full power, very, very high power, all the way up to 100%.
Speaking of charging to only say 80%, do you have to charge batteries all the time to 100%, or every so often to 100% then, or would that battery be, because that's obviously the issue with it, right? Because it never reaches that 100.
Yeah. So if you are using a destination charge point, like one on your driveway or one at your work or the shopping centre or whatever, then for most EVs, I would recommend charging and balancing the car to 100% about once a month or two, just to recalibrate the battery management system. So it's kind of like if you're never fully charging your phone or your laptop, and you're never fully discharging your phone or laptop, eventually its kind of estimate of how much is left in the battery gets a bit off. And imagine doing that with hundreds of cells in a battery pack. It starts to kind of lose its way a bit. Yeah. So to be honest, most electric vehicles are pretty resilient in that regard. But I would say charge and balance. Balance just means that all of the cells are gradually being topped up to the same voltage, because they will eventually stop rising and falling as one. There'll be some voltage discrepancy. So balancing it just means that they're all being brought back in line with each other as best as possible. So that means that you're keeping your battery in good nick, and you're keeping the battery management system up to date on what the latest state of play is. For day-to-day use, if you've got a reasonably short-range EV or a very, very long commute, then just like I did with my 50-mile round-trip commute in my 24 kilowatt-hour Leaf, I had no qualms about charging it to 100% every day and arriving back home with about 40% left in the battery, plugging in, and then charging to 100% again, because I knew I was going to be using that car a matter of hours after it had finished charging.
Yeah.
However, I would not charge that car to 100% and then leave it for a fortnight whilst I disappeared on holiday, because that's when you start to get that, that electrolyte degradation I mentioned earlier at high potential for the cathode. And even with upper state of charge buffers, it's good practice to avoid that, because there are some cars that have particularly small upper SOC buffers. The 30 kilowatt hour Leaf is notorious for this.
Yeah.
So the 30 kilowatt hour Leaf, a lot of low mileage owners would leave them plugged in. As soon as they got home, they would plug it in. They would use it once a week to do a 5-mile round trip to Tesco and back, and then they would plug it back in again. And that, because it was being so-called shallow cycled, it was never really being taken much lower than 80% state of charge, and it was constantly being topped up all the way to 100% and balanced. That means there's actually quite a few low mileage 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leafs out there that have already got signs of battery degradation. They're missing some of their state of health bars. So I would strongly recommend, for infrequent use or for like COVID lockdowns or going away on holiday, try and store the car between about 50 and 80% state of charge. That's kind of an optimum sweet spot. That means that you're not going to be suffering from degradation, but you've also got sufficient juice in the battery to stop it from self-discharging its way down to zero, even if you leave it for months on end. You have to have a car that has really high levels of parasitic drain from the onboard electronics, like Sentry mode in the Tesla, for that to be an issue. But that said, I now have a Model S as well. And for that same round trip commute, I was charging it up to 80%. And then I was only bothering to plug it in again once it got to about 30 or 20%. That whole thing about shallow cycling, particularly at high levels of SOC, that's kind of how you kill a lithium-ion battery. So I recommend, as I said, if it's regular use, then and it's a short range and you need that range, absolutely take it to 100% and then just plug it in once you're down below 50%. For infrequent use, short runs, commutes that you could do several of a week on one charge, aim for about 80% and then plug in around about 20%. Just do the rough ballpark figures, but that's kind of an optimum for battery lifespan. That's being a health freak about it. But the shallow cycling and leaving them at 100% for weeks and months on end, that is definitely more of a stark warning.
So because I can hear some of the people I know screaming at me or asking the question, like, do you... Because obviously, unlike a bucket of water or a tank of fuel, you can't just put a measuring device and kind of judge, it's 3/4 full or half full or whatever. Yeah. With a cell, you just have the voltage and the temperature, and that's all you can guess, basically. So do you have to actually charge? Because some people are being told that they have to charge to full every so often, just so that the BMS kind of knows where the extremity is. Does that mean that you have to discharge it every so often then as well, just to know where the other end of it is? How does that work in your experience?
Now, for a laptop or a smartphone, I would say, you can do that so that it recalibrates the BMS. For an EV, I would not advocate doing that, because that would mean you would end up on a hard shoulder somewhere. So, that's the kind of downside of it, is you will never really know the true capacity of an EV's battery, because one, you're never going to run it flat, because unless you have been severely screwed over by several Ecotricity rapid chargers. But the other thing is that you've also got those upper and lower state of charge buffers, which do still have capacity within them, but the car's just not going to use that for the sake of extending its lifespan. So running it down, I generally wouldn't run my cars down below 20% unless I needed the range. It's there for a reason, but again, leave that kind of 20% buffer, partly for cell healthcare and partly to give yourself that bit of leeway just in case. Obviously, if you have a short range EV and it's like a 50-mile range on it and you got a 40-mile trip, then use it, go for it. I don't blame you. But largely with the latest crop of EVs, those days are over. So, but that said, there will be people like me, you have still got the 24 kilowatt hour Leaf, and there'll be people who've got like the Mitsubishi iMeave and they use them as runabouts. And yeah, as I say, by all means, use that range if you need to. But generally, between 20 and 80% is the kind of sweet spot to be running them. So yeah, to be honest, the battery management system's guess of what the capacity is and what the state of health is, the capacity today, full capacity today versus capacity when it was new, it's all to do with best guess algorithms because it can't physically measure it. You would need to disconnect the battery from the EV and hook it up to some lab equipment to actually fully charge and fully discharge it to figure that one out. So yeah, it will look at voltage, it will look at temperature, it will do Coulomb counting, the ampere hours in and out, and it will kind of match the coulombs to the voltage profile and do some best guess measurements. Some of them are more accurate than others. The Leaf has its dashboard is known as a guessometer for a reason. It's particularly sensitive to ambient temperature, and it's also particularly sensitive to charging speeds. For some reason, it predicts a lower state of health if you have if you're using the granny cable, or if your car has a 3.3 kilowatt onboard charger, than if your car has a 6.6 kilowatt onboard charger, or you've been rapid charging it a lot, which you would think it would be the other way around, and it technically should be the other way around. It's just that its algorithm's a bit wibbly wobbly. And on top of that, to put it into perspective, the ambient temperature thing. I bought my car summer 2017, the Leaf, and it had a state of health reading on Leaf Spy of 92%. And about 10,000 miles later, during the Beast from the East, February 2018, that brutally cold snap with all the snow and so on, the state of health reading was 102%. So not technically possible.
Yeah.
And tell you what, I felt quite smug about it, even though I knew it was rubbish. But
Interesting.
It's all a pinch of salt. But there are some very clever companies out there working on advanced algorithms, trying to take what limited information we can get from the black box that is a lithium-ion battery or a lithium-ion cell,
Okay.
and trying to greater predict its actual capacity, its actual state of health, its remaining useful life, these sort of things. Very, very bright minds working on that, but it'll take a little while before that starts to get adopted en masse in EVs.
Solid state batteries. That's the thing that's a hype. That's the sort of holy grail that everyone mentions. Like, oh yeah, and we're gonna have soon. Not to mention the H word, but I'm not going to go there. Solid state batteries are supposed to be the holy grail of EVs, and we're supposed to be able to recharge within minutes and have 700-mile range cars, and it's all going to be epic, basically. What is your take on solid state batteries?
So yeah, solid state is an interesting one. You're removing the separator and the liquid electrolyte and replacing that with an all-in-one separator / solid electrolyte. There are two different types of solid state electrolyte kind of families, if you wish. The first one is ceramic, which allows fast charging times, but is quite brittle, not ideal for automotive applications if it breaks apart. The other one is polymer-based, and that is flexible, but its ionic conductivity for lithium is quite low, so the charging times are slower. And in fact, Mercedes are already offering that kind of a crude polymer solid-state battery in their electric buses now. But that is with the trade-off of increased range versus the lithium-ion model, but with slower charging times versus the lithium-ion model. So they've kind of accepted the limitations of the chemistry today, but gone, some people will use that, some people will want it. So good on them for taking the plunge. There are attempts being made to do, some quite successfully in the lab actually, to do hybrid chemistries between like a polymer ceramic that combine the best of both worlds. So yeah, that's really good, because what we've seen with solid state electrolytes is that they are far more resistant to the growth of dendrites, little branch-like growths which happen if you use, predominantly if you use a pure lithium anode. So rather than the lithium atoms pigeonholing themselves in between layers of graphite, in between layers of carbon, they would be placing onto a very thin bit of lithium foil. And if you do that in a lithium-ion cell with a liquid electrolyte, the lithium ions don't do the sensible thing and coat uniformly. They start to form these little branch-like growths. And those can puncture the separator, cause an internal short circuit with the cathode, and that allows electrons to rapidly move between the electrodes, even if the cell isn't connected to anything. Rapid discharge, rapid heat generation, and rapid potential fire. So what we have with solid state is the ability to use a lithium foil with vastly reduced likelihood of dendrite growth. It's not necessarily completely been eliminated, but there are efforts to completely eliminate it, and the results are looking quite promising. So once that is ready, once that can be commercialized, you're looking at, as you said, the Holy Grail. Because you've removed the bulk of having all of that carbon in the anodes, because you require 6 carbon atoms to hold one lithium ion or one lithium atom in a lithium-ion electrode. So you've just removed all that bulk. It means you can shove more active material in there, because it's all lithium in the anode now, and that is 100% of that anode could theoretically take part in the discharge reaction in a lithium-ion cell. So very, very efficient. The separator, the electrolyte, which replaces the separator now because it's solid state, could in theory be made quite thin as well. So it's all adding up to a very compact design, a very energy dense design. That's where you're getting those 500, 700 mile range EV ideas from.
I see.
And in theory, if you manage to harness the best of the ceramic, electrolytes, then you could get rapid charging. You could also get improved temperature windows in which these cells could run, so they could actually deliver quite a lot of power in particularly cold Canadian winters. They could, they could suffer from minimal degradation, heat-based degradation in Dubai or somewhere like that. So genuinely, it's a pretty well-suited chemistry to some extreme environments. But that said, the existing lithium-ion gigafactories, which may not necessarily be perfectly tooled for creating solid-state lithium cells, billions have been invested, billions of dollars have been invested in all of these, hundreds upon hundreds of gigawatt hours of capacity. So lithium-ion is still here for the foreseeable future. There will be other chemistries which can be produced on lithium-ion production lines, like sodium-ion, which you take a hit on energy density, but there's about a 30% cost reduction. So, that would be used for your kind of cheap and cheerful entry-level EVs. That would be used for your electric buses and things. It would be a competitor for LFP. Interestingly, with LFP, though, we now have Tesla using LFP in the Chinese-built Model 3, because CATL, gigantic manufacturer of batteries over in China, have developed this cell-to-pack packaging methodology that means that LFP, which is less energy dense, can actually be packaged in such a way that you can get a good couple of 100 miles range out of it, which was previously unthinkable. So, solid state, I think it will be used in premium EVs, it will be used in stupidly long-range EVs, but I'm keeping a close eye on LFP, because that, and potentially by extension sodium-ion, because, this cell-to-pack packaging methodology, you're combining that with a material which doesn't contain cobalt, doesn't contain nickel. I mean, it's iron and phosphorus. So it's basically made of rust. It is super cheap. That is also
good enough,
much safer. It's a safer chemistry as well. It's longer lived. It's more ethical, etc. It has a lot of advantages, and we'd previously written it off for cars, but all of a sudden it's making a resurgence. I would be very surprised if we didn't see more manufacturers adopting LFP over the next few years. So solid state definitely does have a place, but interestingly, the one that a lot of people had written off, the lithium-ion chemistry that a lot of people had written off for cars, is making a comeback. This is interesting.
Okay, I don't have enough knowledge of solid state to kind of. I know they do have their applications. I think they're used in medical equipment. But obviously that's just like you said, there's a massive difference between what you have in your laptop or your mobile phone to what you have in an EV. It's a completely different scale of and environment and use patterns, which actually leads me to my last question, because the V2G used to be a massive thing that everyone was raving about, and it was supposed to be the future, and it is certainly usable in loads of places, but obviously most common household will have 1 or 2 cars, and you will use them during the day, which is where you would charge it from sun or whatever. And you could recharge it at night, but it's whenever it's either easy to charge or cheap to charge and usable to discharge, it's away or it's not charging. It's a car. It's a different. Its purpose is different. The battery, like home battery storage, seems to be on the app now, and there's loads of companies offering different sizes of them and so on and so forth. And I used to be a big proponent of V2G, but these days I'm thinking we could probably design batteries that are cheaper, and we already probably have the technology to have those battery storage systems for houses or domestic storage available. What do you think? Do you think we need a different type of batteries for home storage, or do we already have it? What's your take on it?
Well, home storage, you're looking at a usage pattern that's very different to an electric vehicle, because it's a more predictable load. It's far less dynamic. It's far less kind of stabby with harsh acceleration and regenerative braking. It's generally lower loads, more constant loads. So it's an easier life for batteries, and that's where you are going to see a divergence towards cheaper chemistries that are maybe not necessarily as energy dense, because there's more space to mount the home energy storage system or the commercial scale grid storage system. So again, LFP looks quite promising there. I'm aware of some systems that use lithium titanate, which is a particularly expensive chemistry, but is very, very long-lived. And then the other option, which is quite interesting, is second life electric vehicle battery modules, because they may have 70 or 80% of their original capacity left, which is considered end of life for automotive, but that's a lot of capacity for grid storage. And that means that for a home energy storage battery, the likes of which PowerVault make from second life EV batteries, or at least one of their product ranges that they do ones with brand new cells as well. You're looking at many years of easy life for these cells, which would otherwise have been prematurely retired. So yeah, I reckon we'll see an interesting mix of the second life EV battery within the domestic energy storage scene. We'll probably see, LFP, sodium ion, and then, the likes of Tesla, they are using NMC. The Powerwall, to be fair, has one of the highest capacities of any home energy storage system on the market at the moment, and it's also one of the cheapest per kilowatt hour capacity. One of the more expensive to buy, but you get a lot of value for money. So, the argument is, do you really need to spend, as a manufacturer, do you need to spend money on cobalt, which is expensive, on nickel, which is cheaper, but then again, iron is even cheaper again? These materials, do you need to spend big bucks on them for a battery system that's not overly space constrained and is going to have quite an easy life?
Yeah, to me, that's a very sort of interesting subject, because I think more houses, especially in the UK, are able to gain a lot of sort of economical value from cheap energy storage, domestic energy storage sort of utilities than from an EV, which is going to be more expensive. But then the question is, like you said, Tesla batteries are Powerwalls are very cheap compared to other competitors per kilowatt hour. But the initial outlay is still massive. So there's a massive sort of gap, and I just wonder if there's a room for somebody to come in and say, okay, we have these 5-year-old technology battery production lines ready just to churn out loads of batteries that will fill in the gap. To me, that's where the market probably should be growing. But I'm by no means an expert in or analyst in that area. So
yeah, I mean the vast majority of production lines, realistically, if it's geared towards lithium ion, it should be able to do just about any variant of lithium ion, including newer, more modern chemistries, some of which are cheaper as well, because you've got less cobalt content, etc. Yeah. So in terms of making older cells with the thinking that they would be cheaper, that's not necessarily going to be true. However, in terms of using a production line to churn out sort of cheaper cell chemistries, which are still quite sturdy and reliable, etc., for the home energy storage market, that's absolutely something that could be done. But the reason that a home energy storage battery is more expensive than an EV battery is because EVs are selling by the tens, hundreds of thousands, that kind of idea. And the order quantities for the likes of Samsung and Panasonic and all of that, the big cell manufacturers, is absolutely vast. And that means that the unit price of those cells comes down considerably. Whereas home energy storage, it's taking off, but the manufacturers are buying less per product, because you're typically single digits of kilowatt hours, maybe just breaking into the double, as opposed to double maybe breaking into the triple with EVs. And also they're selling less of them than EV manufacturers are selling of EVs. And as a result, it's economies of scale. So that's why you're looking at several £100 per kilowatt hour for a home energy storage system battery. Whereas rumour has it, Tesla is now getting its hands on, I'll mention it again, LFP cells for between $60 and $80 per kilowatt hour. Typically within the EV world, you're looking at about, sorry to mix up my currencies here, but 100 to 150-ish pounds per kilowatt hour seems to be the industry average for EV cells.
Yes,
and that's come down from about 10 times that when the Nissan Leaf was first launched, and that is continuing to decline.
I'm curious, like your day-to-day life as a sort of as a battery expert. How I'm sure there's going to be people interested, and I think this is we need engineers and we need people who research these things. Plug yourself in, what do you do? How people can actually, if anyone had a commercial need to contact you, and how do people, if somebody's younger and interested, how do they become somebody like yourself? Where's the need, in that sort of environment? I don't know. I don't have any particular question. I'll let you kind of have the floor and just say your things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I kind of had an unusual route into this because I did an applied physics degree called Renewable Energy at the University of Dundee, and I ended up getting into battery tech because the person who would become my project supervisor drove up next to me in a Peugeot 106 electric with NiCad batteries, which I would ultimately end up doing my project on, buying off them. It would become my daily driver as I commuted from Dundee to St Andrews when I was working with Peter Bruce's research group there before they relocated down south, and took me with them. So that car is now in a transport museum awaiting its next big adventure at Dundee Museum of Transport. The intention is to fit new batteries to it, like cutting edge stuff at some point. Anyway, I did an applied physics degree, as I said, and then ended up getting into a PhD with an electrochemistry group. I would, in terms of if you're based in England in particular, then WMG, University of Warwick, and also just across the road from them, pretty much Coventry University, are doing some really cool stuff on battery research. And that includes engineering as well as the kind of hardcore electrochemistry side of it. University of Birmingham's doing amazing work with battery recycling. Back up in Scotland, there are numerous different research groups within the kind of battery fields, but St Andrews remains one of the more kind of prominent ones. So Professor John Irvin, mostly associated with fuel cells, but they've also got a big battery research group there too. So that's worth checking out. University of Edinburgh's been dabbling in this as well. And also keep an eye on what's happening over on the West Coast as well, because within the sort of typical chemistry and electronic engineering sort of groups, you'll have people doing batteries and battery modelling and things. It's becoming an increasingly big setup that for universities to pursue. In terms of the best kind of degrees to have, certainly physics is highly transferable, and you can make it basically you can make it what you want it to be. So that's a pretty cool situation. If you're doing a kind of sciencey kind of degree like physics or chemistry, by all means you can try and audit any more kind of electrochemistry goings on within your university if you're lucky enough to have a pretty good research group within that university. See if you can try and help out in the lab, that sort of thing. They're normally quite good at taking on project students to assist and to learn and to quite possibly end up doing their PhD and their postdoc there someday. So that's a really good option for you. And then also, you've got the likes of your chemical engineering degrees, etc., which could potentially help as well. But yeah, it's actually quite difficult because I'm trying to think, what did all my colleagues do? Because it wasn't what I did. I was the kind of odd one out. But yeah, anything that's broadly STEM based, will get you in the door. Particularly if you show the interest. And then there's the other side of it as well. Like, there's mechanical engineers are required for optimum cooling mechanisms and module designs, which includes modeling where the heat's going to accrue in bus bars and things like that, not just within the cells. Electronic engineers for the battery management system, absolutely. So anything within kind of engineering as well as science. Civil engineers, it sucks to be you, but everything else, you're in the door. We might need to. Civil engineers. There's a lot of gigafactories being built right now. Boom, there you go. So that definitely helps. But yeah, those are the best kind of routes to go. And there's also quite a lot of now that COVID has hit, everything's kind of moved online. So you've got quite a lot of webinars and teleconferences that are coming up, and if you get involved in the kind of battery Twitterverse, then absolutely keep an eye out for those sort of things. Actually, that also brings into mind some other notable research groups to check out. So you've got Billy Wu at Imperial College London, and his team, Gregory Offer as well, kind of like this one big family, Dyson School of Engineering Design, at Imperial College London, doing some fantastic work on all things battery, from the mechanical side, from the modelling side, from the electrochemistry side. Saiful Islam at University of Bath, one of the leading battery scientists in the country. He did the Royal Society Christmas lecture that was on the BBC a few years ago. An excellent educator. He's fantastic at putting these concepts across in a way that you can understand. And then also, it would be rude of me not to mention my former PhD supervisor. So I've mentioned Peter Bruce because he's now located at Oxford. And when I moved down there, I also started to work not just with Peter Bruce's research group, but David Howie's research group. And they, again, are probably more involved in the modelling and the battery management, the electronics side of things, but they are incredibly knowledgeable when it comes to batteries. And they're excellent supervisors as well. So if you're looking into PhD opportunities, that's kind of the main lot to consider within the UK at the moment. There will be a few more that will inevitably come to mind as soon as we've finished recording this podcast. But those are the kind of key ones that come to mind. Oh well, so and the other one as well is if you go into academia and you're looking for a way into industry. Well, I mean, for a start, if you go to WMG, basically Jaguar Land Rover stand at the front doors with a net and just wait on PhD candidates. And boom, you'll do it. You're working for us now. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. But I would also keep an eye within, if you're looking to go from academia to industry. Another one that's absolutely worth keeping an eye on is Michelin Scotland Innovation Park, MSIP, up in Dundee, my adopted home city, where I learned my trade and drove my first EV and so on. So it's the former Michelin tyre factory, which closed down at the middle of last year, and has been renovated into an energy park, a renewables park, an e-mobility park as well. There are some very, very interesting businesses moving in there, and they are expanding, and they are looking for your expertise. We're talking batteries, we're talking fuel cells, we're talking the vehicles, the supply chain. There's all sorts of interesting things going on there. They are a very talented bunch. And then further north as well, you have Amti Power and Denshi Group as well, which have an interesting semi-detached battery factory up as far north as you can get on the mainland in Thurso. And they're both doing some really cool things to do with next generation battery tech and battery systems as well. So if you fancy the romantic nature of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, which if you've seen my Sky road trip, you'll definitely want to do that because it's just absolutely gorgeous. What a fantastic setting to be. So They are absolutely worth checking out. If the West Midlands is just a bit too densely populated and a bit too concrete jungle for your liking, there's ways that you can have it both ways. You can have cutting edge battery stuff and the most incredible scenery on your doorstep. And by the way, Dundee is an absolutely freaking amazing city as well. It's getting all the Culture Vulture write-ups. Like absolutely stunning city, and I miss it every day. So yeah, those are really, really solid options to consider too.
Yeah, just going back to our conversation. I had a thought when you were talking about the and I might completely butcher this, but you were talking about anodes and build up on the and that electrons are not very good at kind of laying flat basically on the anode, for lack of better description. But I've always been told when I did electronics that the current will always choose the shortest path. The path of least resistance. Is that because of that, or is that why they build up in sort of a tree, as you said, or branches? The growth that gets on the anode, or build up on the anode, or is there a different? Does the physics work different on that level? From your
it could be to do with localized current density, and it could also be that the lithium ions are going, well, this dendrite is closest kind of path to where I need to go, so I'm just going to join onto that.
Okay.
But there will no doubt be some localized current densities within the cell due to the design of it, because it's with the exception of Tesla's tabless cell design, that's just actually in reality one gigantic tab that covers the entire edge of the cell to allow electrons in and out. Most cells, there's kind of limited areas through which the electrons can enter and exit the electrode structure. So, you'll end up with those localized bits where the current is that much more dense, and there'll be more or less lithium that's either removed from that electrode in the first place or plated back onto it. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on there. And then of course, the path of least resistance, once you've got an internal short circuit, is the internal short circuit, and it just gets quite nasty from there.
The question that I often get asked by people, and this is sort of like the geeky me thinks about that as well. Like how do you actually work on a battery? What is sort of day to day? Do you just change different things? Test a little bit of. You've got a mixture of different components in the electrolyte, or how do you actually come about researching the batteries? What is the sort of the workflow there, or do you have
I mean, I've worked on so many different levels, down to the fundamental electrochemistry, all the way up to kind of more pack design and integration. So it's too difficult to try and summarize that. But yeah, there will be some career paths / projects where you will be, arms deep in an argon glove box, trying to assemble a prototype chemistry that you've developed from scratch into a little coin cell, which will then go on to a battery tester to check its performance at very small currents. But obviously, the aim is that could be scaled up to something quite substantial. There'll be days when you're taking a commercial cell apart in that glove box to see what the degradation's like after a long run of cycling, doing like an automotive duty cycle, that kind of idea for a couple of months. They'll be setting up those tests where you're rigging up big modules and things, and preparing them for various different test procedures with, varying temperatures, varying loads, varying, like other kind of electrochemical things you can do, like impedance tests and things that kind of detect what the health of the battery is at that point. And then, obviously there's as I said, there's the more kind of module design as well. There's looking at a particular application and the available space and the chemistry that would allow you to get the capacity and the performance that you require, and kind of doing more of an engineering-y, head-scratchy thing around that. I've kind of dabbled in a lot of this over the last decade or so, and it's been quite nice to have that broad range. I've worked with some very talented people who do the modeling side of it as well, so they'll find a way to to mathematically mimic what is going on inside the cell, and then they can use that modeling to predict the remaining useful life of a cell based on a handful of cycles of data. So you can say, yes, this particular cell, because, identical cells, there'll be a piece-to-piece variation between them on the same production line. It can be the silliest little thing that can result in a difference in the lifespan or the internal resistance of that cell. And being able to identify that very early on allows you to grade those cells and match them to appropriate applications, or grade them so if you want the grade A stuff, you pay more. If you want the grade D stuff, then yeah, it's pretty cheap. If you're just going to be using it for home energy storage, not an issue. If you're going to be using it in Formula E, probably want the grade A, mate. That sort of thing. Being able to grade that sort of stuff is a very expensive and time-consuming thing to do. But with these kind of clever models that they're coming up with in research groups and businesses around the country, around the world, then the idea is to get that down to seconds, ideally, and do that reliably. So we're now seeing mathematicians and machine learning gurus coming in who've never thought about electrochemistry before, and taking electrochemists' best efforts at modelling and just smashing it out of the park. So this is a really interesting time.
Yeah.
That said, the modelling side of it is, I've always been more fundamental electrochemistry, cell teardowns, cell and module testing, and sort of next gen design, that sort of idea. I've supported a lot of modelling, but there's some very bright minds who do the kind of mathematical side of it, and what they've achieved has been incredible. I've been very lucky to work with a good 2 or 3 key people come to mind, and they know who they are, who've done some incredible things there.
It does sound very fascinating. I used to work, when I was much younger, I used to work with a lady named Bettina from Austria, who in her previous life, she was a SQL database specialist, and she used to work for, I can't remember which one, a drug research manufacturing company, and they were all doing all their testing and modeling in databases. ML and AI wasn't a thing back then. It wasn't called that, but it was essentially that. It was all modeling and all theoretical. And I just wondered how that, like, the common question you would ask these days is, do we know how all the materials will behave if they were used for the battery? Is it just a matter of now kind of combining the best ones we know about and just testing them in lab, or is there still a lot of unknowns that we can discover in the future? Basically, it's a simple question.
Oh yeah, we're starting to see attempts to use modelling to be able to predict the best materials to use in batteries. That's definitely coming through, but there's still a lot of trial and error in the lab as well.
Okay.
For a start, what the model says is actually a good material, and then being able to make a little prototype of that, and then being able to scale that up to an automotive scale prototype and prove that it can last however many cycles, before it dies. That's all a very different process, and that normally takes a few years, but the modelling should help to reduce that.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely, that's something that we're starting to see. So if you are less hands-on, but you're very good sort of on a mathsy, machine learning, AI sort of side, you can absolutely get in on this. It's far more interesting than just copping out and doing the usual fintech thing.
It is, yes.
If you want to really help the world, then yeah, this is the place to be. It's the Wild West at the moment. You could be the next Professor John Goodenough. You could be the godfather of the lithium-ion battery. You could be the Professor John Goodenough.
He's amazing. Like his life.
Side.
If whoever's watching this never heard of Professor Goodenough, just stop watching this and just come back later, obviously, but just look him up. He's amazing.
Yeah. 97 years old he was when he won that Nobel Prize. He was kind of like, it was like when Leonardo DiCaprio finally won an Oscar. Everyone's like, about time. It's been so long.
Yeah,
do you have no idea how good this man is? So and he's still going. He's still working away. He just loves what he does. He's great. Yeah.
Well, like I said, I do have probably more questions, but I'm conscious of the time. I did warn you that this can go on for a bit. But this was very interesting discussion, and no wonder everyone was telling me all the time, just speak to Euan, speak to Euan, speak to Euan. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I hope we can meet in person one day, because I miss traveling and meeting people in face to face and talking to them face to face.
True, yeah. Eventually there will be, hopefully the vaccination situation will go well this year, and certainly next year, I would hope that we'd have fully charged live, we'd have EVs in the park, we would have Formula E in London. The intention is to make a cameo appearance at those at some point. So absolutely. Cool. If you spot me, give me a shout.
Will do. Now you know how I look like, so.
Yep. There's no hiding. Absolutely.
Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and hope
thanks
to
for having us on. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.